They thought she was just his new quiet wife. But she came with a vow, one whispered at the grave. Of the woman he sabotaged, she didn't seek his heart. She came to dismantle his world. In the remote hills of Antaba, where the wind carries secrets and silence isn't always peace, there lived a man named Bayo. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a voice that could shake the foundations of a room, and a laugh that made grown men nervous. In Taba, Bayo's word was law. The elders deferred to him. The merchants knew better than to overcharge him. The children scattered when his shadow passed. And when Bayo said something was so, the entire village bent around that truth, like acacia trees bending in the harmattan wind. He was feared, but fear, he believed, was a form of respect. At 27 years old, Bayo decided it was time to marry. He wanted a wife who understood her place, someone quiet, someone skilled in the ways of domesticity, someone who would not question him. Ayanda was 22. She had dark eyes that seemed to apologize for their own existence, hands that moved with practiced grace through every task a man like Bayo could demand, and a voice so soft that even her laughter sounded like a confession. Her mother wept at the marriage feast, tears that Ayanda's siblings mistook for joy. But her mother knew.
Somehow, she knew. A mother can always see the difference between a bride and a sacrifice.
For the first 3 months, Ayanda tried. She woke before dawn to prepare his meals. She pressed his clothes until they held their shape like armor. She learned the exact temperature of his bath water, the stories he wanted to hear when he returned from the market. She was, by every measure, the perfect wife. But Bayo's rage had no reason. It lived inside him like a separate creature, waiting only for an excuse to emerge. A meal that was lukewarm instead of steaming. The sound of her footsteps in the compound when he wanted silence. These weren't failings, they were provocations, and each one deserved a response. Behind the walls of their compound, away from the eyes of neighbors, Ayanda's softness became a liability. When Bayo's hand came up, she flinched but said nothing. When his voice rose to a roar that echoed off the mud walls, she lowered her head and absorbed his rage, like dry earth absorbing rain. And when the violence came, the open-handed strikes, the pushing, the nights when he refused to let her sleep, she endured it the way she had been taught to endure all things, in silence. The village heard the sounds but turned away. The neighbors knew, but reasoned that a man must discipline his wife. After all, how else would she learn? How else would she know her place? And Ayanda, shrinking inward with each passing month, began to understand that no one was coming, that her silence was exactly what the world wanted from her. Years passed, 3 years, 4, 5, and with each year, something in Ayanda grew quieter, not her voice, which remained soft, but something deeper, something essential. The part of her that believed she deserved anything different. The part that still hoped. On one fateful evening, Bayo had been to the market and come home angry about the price of grain. Ayanda had prepared his meal carefully, groundnut stew with fish, cassava, fresh palm wine the way he loved it. But when he tasted it, something was wrong. A grain of salt too much, a moment of carelessness in an otherwise perfect execution.
This is poison!
What followed was not a beating, it was an erasure. Bayo did not hit her once or twice or until she begged. She faced the storm until her spirit was still, surrendering to the weight of silence that filled the room. And when she collapsed on the floor of their home, he left her there and went to sleep. The healer came the next morning and examined her still form. She checked her pulse. listened to her breath,
placed her hand on Ayanda's forehead, and then she shook her head. Her spirit has left. She was too tired. Her body gave up because her spirit no longer wished to stay.
No investigation, no questions. Ayanda was 31 years old, and her death was attributed to exhaustion, as if a woman's will to live was a candle that could simply burn out. As if she had chosen to leave, rather than having been driven away. Bayo wept at the funeral. He tore at his clothes and threw dust over his head.
He wailed her name to the sky as if calling her back from death itself.
The women who had heard her screams weeks before now held him as he cried. Even Ayanda's mother unexpectedly offered solace to the man who took her daughter's life, because that was what the village expected. That was the performance they had all agreed to watch. The grief, they said, proved he had loved her. 3 months after Ayanda was buried, Bayo decided to marry again. He traveled to a village 2 days' walk from Antaba, to a region where his name meant nothing, where his past was a clean slate. And there he found Lulama. She was beautiful in a way that seemed almost accidental, long-limbed, with high cheekbones and eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you.
She was quiet, as Bayo required. When he spoke, she listened.
When he looked at her, she looked away with practiced modesty. Her father was eager to marry her off. Her mother seemed relieved to have her leave. Bayo returned to Antaba with his new prize after only 2 weeks of courtship. But Lulama's quietness was not born from the same place as Ayanda's. It was not born from a lifetime of being told to be small. It was born from something else entirely. Because before Bayo had even seen her in that distant village market, Lulama had already heard his name. A traveling healer had mentioned it, along with a story about a man whose first wife had died under mysterious circumstances. A story about a young woman, barely 30, who had simply stopped breathing. And something in that story had struck Lulama with the force of recognition. She had spent the following weeks searching. She had traced Bayo's name back to Antaba. She had spoken to merchants who traveled between villages, asking about a man so feared that he needed no introduction. And finally, she had found her way to Ayanda's grave. The grave was unmarked, save for a cross made from twisted vines. But Lulama knew. She stood there in the dust of a foreign village and swore a vow that no god was listening for, that only the earth could hear. When Bayo returned to find her in that market, looking vulnerable and suitable, it was not luck. Lulama had placed herself there. She had learned his schedule from the gossip of other travelers. She had made herself available. And when he looked at her, she let him believe he was choosing. The greatest act of control is allowing another to believe they have seized it from you. For 6 months, Lulama lived a careful performance. She cooked his meals perfectly. She trembled when he raised his voice. She bowed when he entered a room. She played the role of the perfect wife, so convincingly that even the village women began to gossip that Bayo's new wife was even more obedient than Ayanda had been, that he had finally found his match. But during those 6 months, Lulama was not obeying. She was studying. She studied the rhythm of his moods. She learned that his anger peaked in the evenings, after he had been at the market drinking with the other men. She discovered that he was vain, that he feared being disrespected more than he feared anything else. She observed that his power was built entirely on the performance of dominance, that if one person stopped believing in his strength, the illusion began to crack. And most importantly, she learned where he kept his secrets.
In a locked box beneath the floorboards of their compound, hidden beneath dried grains and cloth, Lulama found it, a journal. Bayo's private confessions.
Pages filled with his thoughts, his remembrances of Ayanda. And buried within those pages,
A single sentence that made everything clear. She made me do it. Not an apology, not a confession of guilt, but an admission, an acknowledgement.
a key piece of evidence that could decisively prove guilt in a courtroom. Lulama photographed every page with the small camera she had smuggled into Antaba. She made copies on paper she had kept hidden, and then she hid the journal exactly as she had found it. By the way, if you're still here,
Go ahead and tap the like button so I know you're with me. And if you're enjoying this story, leave a comment. I read every single one. All right, let's keep going.
it happened on an ordinary morning. Lulama sat across from Bayo at breakfast, as she had done hundreds of times.
But this morning, she was reading a book. Not a prayer book, not a cookbook, a novel.
A work of fiction, something frivolous, something unnecessary. Bayo noticed immediately.
What is that? What is that?
A book.
I can see it's a book. Why are you reading it? There is work to be done.
Lulama closed the book slowly. She placed it on the table, and then she looked at him, not with the downcast eyes of submission,
But with the steady gaze of someone who had made a decision.
No!
No? You dare!
I dare very much. Your clothes are dirty. You can wash them. The compound needs sweeping. You can sweep it.
Bayo's face darkened. His fists clenched. And when he moved toward her, it was with the certainty of a man who had never met real resistance. He raised his hand to strike, just as he had struck so many times before. But Lulama was not Ayanda. She moved like fire, swiftly, without hesitation, without mercy. She caught his wrist, twisted it, and threw him on the floor. For a moment, Bayo could not breathe, nor think. Stood something fundamental, that his strength was not absolute, that there existed in this world a force he could not overcome.
I know about Ayanda. I know what you did. I have the proof. And if you ever raise your hand to me, the entire region will know. Every village, every elder council, they will know you are not just a wife beater, but a murderer. And you will hang. Now, cook your own breakfast.
What followed was not a sudden reversal. It was a systematic, deliberate dismantling. Lulama did not merely control Bayo. She erased him. She made him the servant in his own home. Every morning she refused to cook. Every evening she watched as he labored over pots and pans with hands that had never known such work. She made him wash her clothes. She made him sweep the compound in view of the entire village. She made him fetch water from the well, while the other women whispered and laughed. And because she held the evidence of Ayanda's death, evidence that Bayo knew could destroy him completely, he obeyed.
The village watched in disbelief. The fearsome Bayo, the man whose name had made them
Tremble, now reduced to a servant in his own compound. At first, they thought it was temporary, a strange phase that would pass. But as the days stretched into weeks and the weeks into months, they began to understand the order of the world had shifted. Lulama became the one who was respected. When she spoke at the market, people listened. When she made a decision about the compound, it was final. The village women came to her for counsel, and Bayo, once the most feared man in Antaba, became a cautionary tale whispered to children at night. He tried, once, to rebel.
I will not be enslaved.
He
in my
refused
own
to do
home.
his chores and declared that he would not be enslaved in his own home. Lulama's response was swift and terrible. She walked to the village center, carrying Bayo's journal in her hands, and read passages aloud. She did not need to read everything. A few sentences were enough. Enough to make the elders pale. Enough to make the village women understand. When Bayo returned to the compound that evening, his eyes were hollowed out. He understood, finally, that he would never be free again. That Lulama did not need to use physical violence to control him because she had something far more powerful, the truth. Months later, on a night when the moon was hidden and the only light came from distant stars,
Lulama found herself walking through the village graveyard. She knew exactly where Ayanda's grave was. She had visited it many times since that first day, but always when the village slept, always in secret. She stood before the small cross made of twisted vines and felt something shift inside her chest.
It was not relief. It was not satisfaction. It was something heavier and more complicated.
I did it. I broke him. For you. For what he took from you.
But as she paused, her thoughts drifted to Bayo, not the ruthless killer, but the broken person he had become. She thought about him washing clothes by the river, his hands raw from soap and work. She thought about the hollowness in his eyes. She thought about how she had taken everything from him. His power, his dignity, his future. And for just a moment, she wondered if she had become the very thing she had set out to destroy. But then she remembered Ayanda's last days. She remembered the bruises that had never faded, the fear that had become her permanent companion, the way Ayanda's spirit had simply stopped fighting. She remembered
the way the village had turned away, had allowed a man to murder a woman and call it grief.
Lulama knelt before Ayanda's grave and she whispered,
I'm sorry I couldn't save you, but I broke him. I made sure he will never do this to anyone else. I made sure the world will know what he is. That's not mercy, but it's justice.
She rose and walked back to the compound, where Bayo was waiting to prepare her meal. He stood when she entered, his movements automatic, his eyes empty. He had become a ghost haunting his own life. And Lulama carried on, neither at peace nor at war, but somewhere in between. She had entered Bayo's life as his wife and had become his warden. She had set out to destroy him and had succeeded, but the victory had a bitter taste.
And the weight of it would never fully leave her shoulders.
The village eventually began to speak of Lulama with awe. They told stories of the woman who had tamed the untamable man. But they never spoke of Ayanda anymore. Ayanda's grave became just another cross in the graveyard, her story swallowed by the larger narrative of Lulama's triumph. Perhaps that was the cruelest irony of all. They say pride comes before a fall, but in Antaba, they learned something else. Sometimes fall is not sudden, sometimes it is slow, sometimes it is quiet, and sometimes it is permanent. The question is not whether justice was served. The question is what we become in the pursuit of it, and whether the cost of vengeance is ever truly worth what we lose of ourselves in the winning. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you, I really appreciate you. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time. It helps keep these stories going. Let me know what you thought about the story in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if someone came to mind while you were listening, share this with them. I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.